Welcome to Ambient Discourses, conversations with musicians and composers who create musical experiences and sonic landscapes. If you've been around the ambient and new age music scene at all in the past 2 or 3 decades, I dare say that my guest on the podcast needs absolutely no introduction. But for the sake of bringing newer ambient music fans up to speed, allow me this brief forward. My guest has released over 50 albums over the span of 4 decades, with his first release debuting in 1982. His name is synonymous with other electronic music giants like Brian Eno, Aphex Twins, and Max Richter. Please welcome Robert Rich. Robert, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your name has cycled through so many different avenues that I've been exposed to in the ambient music world, and while I'm not a newer musician myself, but newer to the ambient genre, your name keeps popping up, and you have, my friend, have a very prolific career. You've spanning over 40 years. Your first album released in 1982, over 50 releases on Bandcamp alone, plus all of the collaborations that you've been a part of. How did you get started? And what kind of cascaded into this desire to create music, and how did you fall into it?
Oh, well, I grew up with music. My father was a jazz guitarist, and I grew up, he was very much into the West Coast cool school, Stan Getz and Barney Kessel and that kind of thing. In fact, he almost got it. He played on a couple of the Vince Guaraldi Peanuts soundtracks in the early 70s, not on the famous ones, but a little bit later. And he was going to sit in with Vince Guaraldi in 1976 on the day that Guaraldi died, actually. He had a once a month session at a club in Redwood City in California, and where I grew up, Menlo Park area. And so, yeah, there was always music around. His best friend would come over and they'd jam all night, and we'd kind of sleep on the couch as little kids and things. So, I grew up around it, and I, in the 70s, discovered experimental electronic music in Europe and progressive rock and all of that stuff that, we would grow up into in the 70s. So because I was sort of an electronics nerd, I started building synthesizers. Why wouldn't you? Because I couldn't afford them. So there was this company in Oklahoma called Paella, and they made kits, and you could, for $36 you could build a VCO, and you'd slowly over a couple of years end up with an almost playable pile of junk, essentially. But it was, I was doing this on paper route and gardening money, so I couldn't go out and buy a Moog modular or something like that. So you then learn how to make the best out of insufficient equipment. Yeah. And so my musical language really grew up out of trying to find ways of making something that won't stay in tune, make some interesting noises. So I started patching like insect noises and self-modulating patches and things that made little wibbly sounds. And it sort of developed a language of long-term static droning, twittering noises, which, then you try to figure out how to bring this to the public somehow. And so when I was a freshman in college, I decided to do an all-night concert and encourage people to fall asleep, with the sleeping bag and in the dormitory in my freshman dorm. Yeah. And that was 1980. It was January of 1982. By the time I graduated from undergrad in college, I had released 3 or 4 albums and just kept. It's like, I just try to put out something about once a year if I can, and it's been 41 years of trying to do something about once a year, and it's ended up being 50 or 60 albums.
Wow. Tell me more about the sleep experience. I know you've probably talked about it to exhaustive lengths in previous interviews, but what inspired you to want to try something that unique?
Well, inspired by a lot of other artists. So I was very interested in Terry Riley and influenced by him a lot. And back in the late 60s, he used to do these all-night organ looping concerts. Sometimes everybody a little bit probably unable to sleep due to chemical means. Right. And, it was a different era.
Yes.
And Also, there were one or two artists in the Fluxus scene in the 60s who were doing experimental be-ins with, this one guy, Paul Heyman, I think was his name. I might have the first name wrong. Would put whistles in his mouth and fall asleep on a hammock in an art gallery, and the sound of his breathing through the whistles would be the art piece. And so I sort of thought that was interesting, but maybe a bit lazy. It would be more, I guess I had a work ethic or something. I felt like, but maybe I should be the one staying awake and let them fall asleep, But of course, during the punk scene, everybody was doing 30-second songs and getting off a stage after 20 minutes of, ripping through their entire set list. And here I was, making very few notes over 8 hours, and it really wasn't a very good business model. But it was an art piece. There were other prior art as well. I mean, I was really interested in ethnomusicology, and there's very long form musical traditions. The Navajo medicine rituals, like the blessing way and things like that, they'll take 3 days, and the shaman who is doing the healing part of the ritual has to memorize days and days worth of chanting and things, and one mistake and it's invalidated. So it's a very specific, very precise kind of thing. Also, Indian classical music concerts would often go on all night long because some of the ragas are written for different hours, and if you want to hear an early morning raga, you'll have to hear it at 4 a.m. So there's that tradition. Also in Indonesia, like the wayang shadow puppet plays that reenact the Ramayana, those could go on a weekend. Like the whole village comes out and cooks meals and sleeps and listens, and the performance will go on for a day or two. So these ideas about long form music have been around in our culture for millennia, and I felt like as Westerners, we didn't really have any social sacred traditions, except going to church or something. And I felt that for those who didn't have a tradition of going to church, there would be a need for something to enhance one's meaning in life that would be interesting and shamanic, in the sense that it's taking you into a new place, into altered states of consciousness, and also social and a group-oriented thing. And so this idea of inviting people to come together with strangers and have a reason to be united in some very unusual, dislocating kind of activity struck me as being an interesting art concept, if nothing else. After I did the first one, there was a bit of interest, and I was working in sleep research as an undergraduate. And so I did some things for like the Association of Sleep and Dreaming at an Asilomar conference, and I did some things at a sort of place that did lectures and talks up in Berkeley. There was this sort of storefront called Shared Visions that was in Berkeley, and people like Robert Anton Wilson would talk there, or there was this place where they were willing to. It was just this one guy who ran this storefront, and he lived in back, so he was willing to stay up all night and do this for me and with me. And we'd invite 20 or 15 people. All the place could fit. Here's another problem with the sleep concert: is that when you're lying down, you can't fit as many people in a room as when you're sitting or standing. So this room might have been 50 feet long and 25 feet wide or something, but it could only sleep maybe 20 people. So it became a sort of talking point. It's something I could put on my resume as a really unusual thing that I did, and it became a bit of a thing. It sort of became what I got known for, even though I was much more likely to release albums of more active, experimental music.
Let's take a short break in the conversation to listen to one of Robert's earlier works. This is Requiem from his 1998 release, Below Zero, here on Ambient Discourses. turning to your latest album, Traveler's Cloth. Holy cow! I listened. I first heard it last night. I got a chance to listen to it in advance, but then today I went on a walk with the dog, and I put the very last track, which for the benefit of the listener, it's a seamless representation of all of the compositions strung together.
It's the whole album the way you would hear on a CD,
right.
The way it's meant to be heard.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And it became this walking meditation time for me, this contemplation, because you have this ability to really transport the listener into another time and space, and that's for me what it was. And you, by the way, chef's kiss on it. It was beautiful. The whole from start to finish.
Thank you very much.
Everything felt like it had its place and like it belonged, like it was like an ancient tapestry, how every little bit of fabric was just intentionally put there for a reason to help guide the imagery, and that's what it felt like sonically for me.
That's great. In fact, the metaphor that started the album is really from a book by David Hinton on a Taoist painting from 1400, from about 800 years ago. And then I delved deeper into the poetry of Tu Fu, who was a Tang dynasty poet from 750 or so AD. And the metaphor of fabric is actually exactly what comes out of this tradition of the experience of creation. So there's one piece on the album called The Loom of Creation. Mm-hmm. And that is this metaphor of the weaving and the way that the universe, or all of our experiences, are woven together, and in that same sense that you say, that nothing is out of place, that everything has meaning or has a sense to it. And when we're in a state of awareness, we notice how all of these things are interconnected and touching each other, and that nothing is separate. We are not separate from anything. And in fact, ego is simply a myth that we create as a sort of script. Our sense of self is just a script that we play to ourselves. And you can switch that off. Yeah. And once you do switch that off, you notice how everything is interpenetrating. And that is, in fact, this idea of the woven fabric, where every thread has a place, and every thread is touching other threads all the way through the fabric. So that's very much what I was trying to get, that intuitive sense of walking and traveling, because the metaphor in this case of Tu Fu, the poet, was that he was royal family. He was great-great-grandson of the founder of the Tang dynasty and advisor to the emperors at the time. But as he was growing up, the dynasty started falling apart, and invaders from the north and from the southeast, from Mongolia and Tibet, started taking over the bulk of the part of what is now China that was the Tang dynasty. And he was forced to flee. Also, because of the disruption, there was a massive civil war and unrest and uprising. And so for years, the capital of Xi'an was in ruins and burning from invaders and from civil war. And so he had to leave his family home and was wandering for most of his life in poverty and ill health. And he wrote pretty much a poem every day for the 58 years that he lived, but more than one. I think he's known for like 30,000 poems. And he's considered to be one of the great poets of Chinese history. He was also friends with Li Po, who was one of the other great poets and a contemporary of his. And for me, this metaphor of having a deep-rooted home and yet never being able to see it, always being in extreme poverty and hiding from murderers and thieves, shows me this deep sense of distrust that I have for comfort and wealth, which to me is ironic because now in my older years, I'm quite comfortable. And there's a part of me that when I read a story like Tu Fu's, I feel an acknowledgement of how absolutely brief life is and how unimportant that sense of comfort is and how imaginary it is, how very fragile that is. And what I love about his poetry is that it was funny, it was harsh, it was sometimes socio-political, and always emotionally complex, in that he was not some aloof monk, with a Taoist distance observing everything. Instead, he was diving in with full humanity and then twisting it into an observant distance and showing how all of our involvement is actually an essential part of human experience, but yet that we don't have to be emotionally bonded to this involvement, that there is always this observational mode where you can just look and just be. And I found it to be extremely inspiring for music, yet I couldn't really figure out how to create music that would somehow capture this sense of the fabric of existence. I found that his story of wandering became a metaphor for the sound of the album, because it could have this sense of always walking, always this tempo, a stepping tempo. And then the music moves more like Indian music than Chinese music, probably. Although the opening piece has a bit of a no gagaku sort of feeling, a bit like Japanese theater. But the sense where the melody takes you down a thread, like woven, a thread weaving through a tapestry. And that thread is part of this rhythm of the warp and the weft and the loom. So it just became a kind of metaphor for the sound, I suppose.
For me, there was this parallel, this nagging parallel that kept coming back to me the further I got on the album. And at the same time contemplating the history of Tufu and his struggle for kind of looking at the world from the outside in, and making his observations about this and dealing with the concept of home, but you can't return to that, and being almost like this, you're like this alien, and you're a foreigner in your own homeland. And I thought about this from the perspective of being a musician. And I don't, this may be the experience of other people, I don't know, but I know for myself, having for the better part of 20, 30 years wandered through my own personal, what I would even call an exile. You're trying to create music in this ever-evolving landscape that does not want to help you.
No, the life of trying to be a professional musician is a bit ridiculous.
It is. It's in fact, it's almost farcical. It's just this laughable concept, that you can even attain this, and it's if you happen to have, of course, the right circumstances, the right people, the right connections, and all of the things happen to fall into place, and then boom, you might have something that looks like a music career. But I think for the many people who are struggling to find their voice and trying to figure out, why am I doing this? Why am I churning the machine? Why am I creating all of this content for social media? Why do I have to do this? Why, and chasing this ever elusive, all right, the label is going to notice me now, or am I going to get enough?
Well, see, all of those questions that you're quoting, that are common questions with people, are driven by the commodification of art.
Yes.
They're driven by the idea that what we're creating is a product.
Right. And
if we look at it more that what we are creators, it's our existence. And as humans, no matter what we do, if we're a mother or a cook or a software engineer or a farmer, we are inventing. We are still creative people. Mm-hmm. If you're digging a ditch, you could dig a really good ditch, and it's still an act of creation. The problem is that when people make art under the model of commodification, the art is all about expressing ego, and it's all about oneself, and it's about me surviving with my ideas and my art, my money. And the world that we've created, this world of late era capitalism, has turned everybody into just a cog, into a little gear. and the machine just chews on things.
Yeah.
It chews on the planet, and we're just the little gears that chew on everything.
Yeah.
And I think we can just step off of that model with some sacrifices. Or we can compromise with that model and interact with it, but as observers, as outsiders, or as, stealth operators who can come in, interact with the model when we need to, and step out and work on building our own model that might be a little bit more healing or a little bit more nurturing. I felt for a long time a disgust with the what's evolved from European culture and capitalism. Not to say that I don't enjoy making money.
Right.
I need to. This is the world we live. This is what I mean, is you have to compromise with the systems. But in the meantime, we can also create art that questions those compromises, or that can feed into a more healing system. I have trouble with the word healing, because a lot of people will market healing music and things, and I think that's very, I don't know, nobody heals from the same music. I know people who probably heal from death metal. And, I remember growing up with Throbbing Gristle and Hawkwind and really enjoying having something to pound my head against. But the reality is that the culture we're creating right now, this high-tech, high-speed, information-driven culture, is extremely stressful, and it's very dehumanizing. And when you talk about, just as you did a moment ago, social media and getting enough likes, getting enough hits, having the millions of listens on your, YouTube channel or something, so that you can make $200 from Google,
Right.
This kind of thing is toxic. And we need to try to remember the embodiment of art and the embodiment of ourselves, rather than the virtualization of everything. Now, this has been a real difficult lesson, because with the pandemic, we've relied more and more on the virtual experiences, like we are right now, talking on Zoom or Google Meet, or this kind of what has become very necessary for people to stay involved in community. But it's becoming more and more virtualized, and it's becoming harder to have a sense of the essential nature of embodiment and of knowing the physical parameters of our existence, and having our feet grounded. So, I grew up in Silicon Valley, or what became Silicon Valley, and I started becoming more and more bored and disgusted, and feeling the toxicity of the kind of money-driven dream merchants that are driving that environment. The culture I grew up in as a kid in the 70s was a lot of idealists, hippies trying to take over the establishment with their skills in technology in order to undermine this kind of, hyper-capitalism that we've become. Yet what happened is all of that idealism got co-opted with the promise of huge riches.
Right.
And, the idea of having $1 billion company.
Let's check out a track from Robert's latest album, Traveler's Cloth. This is entitled Feathers on a Barefoot Path, here on Ambient Discourses. There's something about that you said that really stuck with me, and that was your comment about earlier too, about community, about the idea of communal listening, that communal experience, and to your point about the struggles of social media and how we're starting to become more and more distant and more isolated. In fact, our listening experiences, most of the time, we're on our freaking devices, and that's where we listen to our music, and it's no longer social as much as it really could be. Do you see, where do you see music going in terms of the role of trying to bring us back as a community? Like, what do you see as an opportunity there for new musicians to start cultivating community versus trying to feed the ego?
I think there's a lot of opportunities. The question is we have multiple streams operating simultaneously. The stream that everybody hears about and the stream that the media pushes is the isolating stream. And it's everybody has their own headphone on and everybody has their own playlist and they're all listening to their own version of what they find important or what somebody has pushed onto them. Now, that is the dominant paradigm. And all of the musicians in that paradigm become chewed on by the machine and spit out eventually. And everything's just sausage, for the sausage maker. Now, the alternatives can run simultaneously with that. They don't have to tear down that machine. The machine is whatever the major media corporations, it's by the way, as an aside, it's no accident that the old big record labels are half owners of Spotify, because now they can figure out how to rip off the musicians in a whole new way, and they make money with stocks. They're making money as investors. They're not in the music business at all anymore. They're in the money business. So that, as an aside, what we've always tried to do, and what people tried to do in the folk revolution in the 50s and 60s, and what they tried to do in the punk revolution in the late 70s, and even in jazz and in all sorts of counterculture art forms, not just music, but all sorts of art, is we've tried to create communities and support each other, just like the hardcore punk scene did in the late 70s, early 80s. Everybody putting on gigs for each other, getting their friends to open for them when they're, if you get big, you have your old bandmates in their bands open for you, like Nirvana did in Seattle, right? Mm-hmm. That's how groups like Pearl Jam and things came up. Is as soon as somebody got famous, somebody invited their friends to open for them. Yeah. And so the community brings together each other. In the community that I've grown up in with ambient musicians, we are incredibly friendly and helpful towards each other. There's not a whole lot of jealousy. Not a whole lot of, some people are haves and other people's are much more obscure, some are have-nots. But I think what we've all tried to do is to hold each other up and to support each other with kind remarks, with reference points. I've for years tried to point to friends of mine that I've respected musically, people like Jeff Granke or Stefano Musso, Ali Odie, or, there's just dozens of great artists out there that we can support. Just like when I was starting, Jeff Granke was a beginning musician living in Seattle. I was living in the Bay Area near San Francisco and San Jose area, and I went on my very first tour of driving up the coast to Eugene, Oregon, and to Portland and to Seattle and Vancouver. Nobody knew who I was. I was completely obscure. I had released cassettes, and I had one album out by that time in Sweden, and it was amazing if I could get 8 people to show up to a concert. And Jeff Granke put on a concert for me with himself opening, and it was at a bar called Squid Row in Seattle.
I love that name.
and we had probably 6 or 8 people there. But this is what I mean about people holding each other up and creating lifetime of friendships, but also the idea that when there's a common thread, there are reasons to support each other and create community and not undercut each other, not undermine, but rather to support. I think that there's movements within women in rock music supporting each other. There's a lot of sort of, girl with the RRR, action, which I think is excellent. And in electronic music, there's a circuit bending kind of community where people get together and they bleep on their broken speaking spells And there could be any number of teenagers getting together at coffee shops, playing guitars or singing or, playing percussion and a melodica and hip hop or whatever. It's possible. It's possible. And people don't have to make it into a career. They can just make it into a way to experience joy. And if some people get really good, then sometimes it becomes a career for them. And that's all that happens, is that you grow up within community. One of the challenges, I think, for this type of music, for ambient music, and when I was starting in the late 70s, early 80s, is that we didn't really have community. It wasn't like a punk scene where there were a bunch of bands playing in bars. It was actually very isolating. Most of us were bedroom musicians, recording to cassette tape, recording to, scrounging for a reel-to-reel, trying to buy our first synthesizer and a delay, a tape delay or something. It was very private music, and I think some of the language grew up out of that isolation and out of a bunch of introverts, really. And so it's funny, it's a bit ironic, because as I talk about community, my own experience has been of a very shy and introverted person who craves community. I actually really wish I were better at community. And so I think of it sometimes longingly at a distance. So sometimes you love what you don't have.
I think you and I are very similar in that regard too. My experience has been isolation from people. You're just stuck in your own little bedroom studio or whatever, wherever you happen to be working in. And it's very difficult to find that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I created this whole media stream thing of the Stolas Relay Station and now the long-form podcast, Ambient Discourses, to meet other people and to hear other people's stories, because there's, to your point, there's so much amazing talent out there and I'm finding just ambient music to be this really broad genre with so many possibilities, so many different avenues of exploration. I mean, of course, you have the modular synthesis, you have sound design, you have environmental stuff where you're going out getting field recordings, and it's just one huge swath of expression and lots of really, really good talent out there with 4 or 5 followers on Bandcamp. They might have a half a dozen albums, and much like me, enough sales to maybe buy me a couple cups of coffee or something.
Oh yeah, I've got audience, listeners who I would have to say that probably a third of my listeners are musicians also, because everybody makes this music. Electronic music is a kind of folk music, and the tools allow people who are non-musicians, untrained musicians, to become musicians, to explore sound. I think that's wonderful. I think that truly, especially with the democratization of synthesizers, the cheapening of them, the fact that they don't cost thousands of dollars anymore, you can get something decent as a plug-in, on some software and not have to buy any hardware at all. That has allowed people to make all sorts of new music, and whether or not it's professional, who cares? It's a way to express yourself. Right. There's something else apropos of a thing that you mentioned a minute ago about how, some of us feel, it's down to this question of ego also and community. I remember, and it's a thing that I need to remember myself. I have to constantly remind myself. There's certain friends that I've had, when I first met them, it wasn't all about them. They would reflect everything back onto me as a guest. I'm thinking in particular an old longtime friend, Paul Hasslinger, who used to be in Tangerine Dream. He's Austrian, and he was in Tangerine Dream from around 1982 or 3 until 1990. Their most productive years, when they were doing, like a film soundtrack a week almost. And when I first met Paul, he had just moved to Los Angeles. It was probably around 1990, and I was down there for a trade show, the NAMM show, which I would do every year I would show off technology for people at booths working. And we knew Paul from a common record label connection with Hearts of Space, and a group that he had helped and sat in with, had a group called Lightwave, had been label mates with me. And so Paul invited me over for the first time around 1990, 91. And I remember sitting at his kitchen table, and he reversed all the conversation very like Aikido, kind of using all of the conversation's force to turn it around back onto me, so that I felt like I was almost being interviewed. And at the end, when I was driving home, I was thinking, why don't I know anything about Paul? At this point, he knows everything about me. and I thought, wow, that is actually an amazing social skill, to just to sit with somebody and talk about them, which is so not what we tend to do. We, as an artist, here I am being interviewed, and here I am talking about me. And so it's so easy to do that.
Right.
And one of the things that I find to be a really interesting life lesson is how to do that other thing. Yeah. How to talk about the other person and get them to tell their life story, like you were just mentioning. Right. That's a fascinating art, and I think it's something we all could learn.
And there's implications musically, of course, in that too, because that art form transcends into collaboration, the idea of listening and putting less value on your own contribution, and asking the tough questions of like, all right, how can I create something that supports this other thing that someone else has done? And
it's the art of improvisation as well.
Right.
And most of this music, I think, is very much rooted in improvisation. It's the way I've worked for years.
Yeah.
I basically I splat and then I edit, and then by default, then I've become a pretty good improviser. I guess I started out, that's how I played piano, is I would just sit down at piano and start improvising. But what that's allowed is for those of us who have a certain shared vocabulary, like if I get together with Ian Boddy or somebody, we can rehearse for just a day and play live together on stage. And we live half a planet apart. He's in England. We see each other for a week, maybe at a time, when we've worked on our 3 albums together. And that ability to listen, and that ability to slide in without having your own ego and to have to say, I need this voice, I need to put this idea into here, rather than to say, oh, what is happening here and what does it need, is an important skill for any improvising musician, I think.
Right. And how give me an example of some of the shared vocabulary that you guys, how did you establish that? And I know it probably looks unique for every person that you collaborate with, but on a deeper level, what does that look like, and how do you guys establish that sort of?
Well, so if you use a metaphor in another musical style, let's call it like in 12-bar blues, or like if you're a blues musician, you can sit in with a bunch of people you've never met, and they can say, let's do an 8-bar blues in D, or let's do a walking blues, or there's going to be specific language that everybody knows. It's like in jazz, what the head is. There's certain standards, and then you can improvise, and people take turns improvising, and then they come back to the head. And so this is sort of a tacit language. Now, we grew up with certain innovators who developed, I think, the equivalent of a 12-bar blues, and that would be like the German sequencer music, the Teutonic sound, Klaus Schulze, Tangerine Dream. So as soon as somebody does an ostinato sequencer part, something like that, suddenly everybody kind of knows, okay, this is what's expected. Now we're going to noodle around on a minor key, and so that's like this music's equivalent to a 12-bar blues. Now, some of us growing up with that spent a lot of time trying to develop a different language, trying to innovate outside of that, even though it's part of our basic vocabulary. So then, it's still, though, if somebody does a sort of ostinato sequencer part, we kind of know what that language is supposed to do, and now we can riff off of it and angulate away from it. We can try to find a new direction that doesn't sound like Tangerine Dream noodling on a mellotron or something. So with Ian Boddy, for example, we both are very familiar with that Teutonic sound, and Ian definitely lives closer to that spectrum, closer to that language. And so I know that if I'm going to interact with him, that I'm going to be working around the edges of that sequencer approach. And so now we'll try to find a different way. I might make some modular synth rhythms that have a certain sound that would be a little bit more syncopated or a little bit more polyrhythmic. And I might improvise with an acoustic instrument like a flute instead of a mellotron or some string synth. So this is kind of, you bring modifications of a certain default language. Also, for example, if I'm working with Stefano Musso, which we've only done one album together, but we're longtime friends. My wife and I stayed with him on our honeymoon in 1999 at his house in Italy. So there is a language of environmental music, and I consider he and I to be very much aligned in our way of listening to the world around us and shaping music out of small sound. And so when we made the album together, Fishers, in the mid-90s, we started with this idea of microsound and this idea of looking very closely at something until it becomes very large. And so these metaphors can become part of a language, and also ethnic traditional music can become part of a language, borrowing carefully from world music, from if it's Native American drumming, or if it's Indian. For me, like Hari Prasad Chaurasia, Indian bansuri, classical flute is a huge influence. And so, like if anybody knows Indian music, I can work with them with these traditions, with modal improvisation, with rules about how one moves up and down or shifts outside of the mode. So all of these, they're common languages around the world.
I want you to hear one of Robert's collaborations. Robert collaborated with Luca Formentini, who's an Italian guitarist, and they produced together an album that's just simply gorgeous. It's called For Sundays When It Rains, and the track is entitled Motes Float in Window Light, here on Ambient Discourses. What have been some of your more notable collaborations where you walked away, you felt like you became, like you grew from that experience and left an indelible mark on your life?
Probably all of them, but I'd say that some of them that had the largest landmark, one of them would have to be Stalker with Lusmord. Brian Williams introduced himself to me in the early 90s, around 93 or something. He read an interview article with me in an English underground magazine. And the interviewer asked me what music I was enjoying right now that didn't resemble my music. And it was an easy question because most of the music I enjoy doesn't resemble my music. And in that interview, I mentioned that I was really liking some of the recent work by some of the noise artists like Hafler Trio and Soviet France and Lusmord, what became termed dark ambient, I think, after we did Stalker. And so anyway, Brian Williams, Lusmord, called me up on the phone. He got my phone number from the interviewer and said, hi, in his Welsh accent that I won't try to imitate. Said, hi, this is Brian Williams, Lusmord. I just read that you liked my music. and I was like, okay, this is how this happens. You put out a good word for somebody and the word comes back. And so we started talking about collaborating and just with conversations for a year or two about how a collaboration would go between my music, which is actually rather gentle, and his music, which is quite brooding and intense. And we came up with the idea of sort of a filmic language of a journey through a very strange place. And so the metaphor became the Tarkowski film Stalker, the way that the people in the zone in Stalker are kind of journeying into the center of the zone with each of their own, misgivings and misguidances. And that the way that Tarkowski was able to evoke a very nonlinear experience with just the most subtle movements of like camera or water or wind or just very subtle sound. It created this haunting atmosphere without any special effects. Nothing but people, running through a sewer pipe with water flowing over them and, wind in a field and things like that. But yet feeling like you were journeying through a really unknown mystery. And so we set out to record that as one long piece, and we did it in person with each other over a period of 2 different intense weeks that we stayed together. They came and visited us, and then I came and visited them, Brian and his wife. And this became an album that I think was a cornerstone for a certain language of dark ambient music, and it became a sort of cliche almost. I think there's a lot of groups that have cemeteries on the front cover and skeletons and rotting corpses and things that are you'll find in the dark ambient bin.
The low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and I think what we did is we managed to innovate a language that actually had a lot of grace to it, a lot of class, without having to go into that rotting corpse territory, but actually something that's quite mysterious and quite elegant.
Yeah, I like that idea of creating almost a visual story from your music. I had a conversation with Paul Whitacombe of Nova Loca. He's from Australia, and his most recent album was an absolute joy and a delight to listen to. Also difficult to listen to because, he's using experiences in grief and loss and difficult times to kind of influence the direction that his music took. But in the end, it becomes this amazing cinematic experience. And I think that's probably the best word that I can think of is cinematic. This idea of that the music itself tells a story and generates these pictures that's different for everyone, obviously. Everyone brings their own history to music, but that having those difficult spaces in music, even if they're riffing off this idea that difficult things can still in themselves be beautiful. And
I think beauty requires that. I think for something to not just be pretty, for it to actually be moving and actually be beautiful, it has to encompass darkness and shadow. And my music is always welcomed with open arms. I have some albums that are quite brooding. I'd say Vestiges would be an example of an album that's soaked in grief, actually. In this case, probably grief about aging and about the death of my parents, and my mother had Alzheimer's, and there was a sense of drifting and a sense of loss. That is an intensely important aspect of beauty, to create an experience that encompasses all the different corners of human experience, but yet integrates them and allows them to be combined with joy. I mean, and the feeling of truly being alive requires that. It requires an acknowledgement of how difficult it can be sometimes. I think probably melancholy and grief are things that enter into my music a lot more than people expect in music. The trio of albums I did, What We Left Behind and Vestiges and Lift a Feather to the Flood with Marcus Reuter, that to me is sort of the post-apocalypse trilogy. It's really my doubting about the human race and about how valid our expectations of our survival might be, and really looking into the state of loss of what we're doing in the world. And that theme has entered into my music often. Even my best-selling album in 1989, Rainforest, was about the loss of the rainforest and my sense of grief about it. Yeah. What We Left Behind is essentially a dream of being projected 1 million years into the future when humans are extinct, and actually had a kind of waking vision, a sort of shamanic vision of a raven coming to me and saying, "Here, get on my back. I'll show you the planet, and I'll show you how beautiful it is since you've been gone." That's where the title came from. The idea that the world will be just fine without us. And the problem is that the destruction we're doing is the destruction of ourselves. And so to finish that album, I had to put all of these elements of grief off onto a shelf so that I could celebrate the strength and the recovering potential of planet Earth. And so after I finished What We Left Behind, I sort of had to go onto that shelf and take all those things down and look at them and work with them, and to make the backside of that album, which, I mean, Vestiges is in many sense side 2 of What We Left Behind, and it's the grief part of it. It's the part of, yes, the planet is resilient, the planet will recover, but look at how we're doing this. This is not good. Right. This is, and it was really about grief of loss.
I've got one more track that I'd like us to check out from Robert's latest album, Traveler's Cloth. It's entitled Footprints Fade in the Rain, here on Ambient Discourses. it's a very, I would say, influenced by Buddhist tradition, where it's you have to embrace both the good things that we like to celebrate, but also all of the really difficult things that give you the like proper perspective.
The crying Buddha sculpture, that sort of thing. And, like what I was saying about Tu Fu's poetry is oftentimes it was full of grief, anger, full of sadness, but yet it was always distant in its unusual way of observing these emotions. He's observing himself observe his emotions, and he's writing about the observance. It's a fascinating distancing. In the last of that trilogy with Lift a Feather to the Flood, Marcus Reuter and I were talking about how we deal with the inability to change the world. And we did that right after Trump got elected. And not to say anything too political, but we felt very much at a loss of what to do with anything that we really valued, like, human kindness or
decency,
all sorts of things. And Marcus is German, and he was visiting here, and he was on tour with Stickmen, which is basically half of King Crimson. And we had to figure out a way to record an album in the 3 days that we had together, because he was on a very brief break from a tour. And so before he came over, we talked about, an idea of what if I just play piano and you play guitar loops and we improvise for a day intensely. And we talked about the themes of these improvisations, and it basically became the theme how in Cervantes' Don Quixote is a clown. He's actually a useless figure in their culture. He's laughable, but yet in the story, he's actually the hero because he's the one person who actually has human decency left. And his clownishness, his stupidity, is actually the most noble action of his existence, because he's trying to hold up the one human value of nobility that he finds to be missing in the world. And to me, this is a metaphor that Cervantes was making about the act of making art. Making art in difficult times when you feel stranded and all the things that you value are becoming devalued. What is the action? It's actually becomes a shamanic gesture of uselessness. And this was this metaphor of lifting a feather to the flood. You're like Don Quixote, tilting at windmills with your sword, imagining them to be the enemy. Yet the different version of this is, as an artist, trying to create an act of beauty, trying to create a small bubble of experience for people whose life might be extremely painful or full of fear, or full of anger. And not to make it too self-important, but that the artist can be like a shaman performing a useless act which has no value in the economy, but yet has the value of creating a sense of place or a sense of balance inside of the person experiencing it. And that is the beautiful aspect of this action, this pointless action. And so it was our useless gesture against the growth of fascism in our culture and throughout the world, actually.
That's really beautiful, and it's amazingly profound. I think it's solid words of wisdom that I think we would do well to meditate on, I believe. I know we should probably finish up pretty soon because your time is almost up. But I could actually point out some secret hidden little Easter eggs. Yeah. If you read the titles of a lot of my albums, they actually become poems, and I do this on purpose. And if you read the titles of Lift a Feather to the Flood, I have it right here, and I can do that for you. Absolutely.
We shed the remnants of last winter. Twining branches make a path. Glistening on wet tarmac, seedlings push through cracks. These storms cast shadows on the ocean. We once forgot that we were made of stars. We will walk away unscathed.
Oh, that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. So, in the process, of all the musicians that I've met, both young and old, I've met a lot of new musicians, a lot of that are just starting out. At our closing remarks here, in this ever-evolving landscape of the music industry, what bits of advice would you offer those that are just starting out on their journey?
The most personal statement you can make is going to be your most universal statement. The most hermetic action you can take is going to be the most globally understood, because we hide deep inside of us, we hide it from ourselves, the thing that is the most human in us. And we all walk on this kind of desert world, and we spend our lives trying to find places to dig a well deep down into that ocean. And when we pull up the water from the deepest place, it's going to be the most pure water.
Now I'm speechless. And tears. Robert, you are a shining beacon in a very rich and dark and bright world, and it has been an absolute joy and privilege and an honor to speak with you and to hear the wisdom that you've acquired over the years, your experiences, and I hope that I too can have many same experiences like you, and just being able to enrich the lives of other people like you have. And
thank you for honoring me with this time. I really appreciate it.
It's my privilege. Thank you. Wow. It's remarkable how deep of a conversation you can have with someone who you've never met before, and you've only seen in shadows or pictures or caricatures, but Robert Rich is the real deal. And I feel that my life, my time here on Earth has been enriched just in the short conversation, the short 60-minute conversation I had with him. And he has a level of wisdom that I think we would all do well to stop, take note of, meditate on, and apply to our life. I do hope that I can have another conversation with him again soon. He is an absolute beautiful human being, and it's an honor to have met him. You can hear more from Robert Rich at his Bandcamp site, robertrich.bandcamp.com, where he has nearly his entire discography available there. You can also hear more from Robert Rich on our ambient music program called The Stolas Relay Station on episode 3.41, aired August 13th, 2023 at stolas.com. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and we'll see you right back here for more conversations with musicians and composers who create sonic landscapes here on Ambient Discourses.